Uh, all right, everybody. Super cool for me to be here, third year in a row. It's kind of home turf for me. My family lives in Zurich, and so I always use NOAH to kind of, sneak out of Berlin a bit earlier to visit my family. So I always like to speak here. Super nice. I'm going to talk about fermentation in food. I'm going to talk about more generically or more broadly about the industry. I thought about, what I'm going to bring today. And the past years, I've been speaking about Formo, our company, in a bit more detail, but I think this year I want to focus a bit more on the industry as a whole and why I believe it's not getting as much attention as it actually should. If we think about agriculture, many people actually don't know. I mean, when we look at the climate crisis, a lot of people are talking about the energy sector, about the transportation sector. But when you look into animal agriculture, or agriculture in general, is actually one of the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So we heard it before from Christoph, whole food and agriculture emits a third of all global emissions worldwide. And specifically when we look into animal agriculture, obviously the numbers, and many people maybe who are listening to this talk today are aware of it, are actually crazy. We have 4% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions coming from the dairy industry alone. And to give you a bit of a reference, what that means is that it's roughly equivalent to all the planes and the ships in the world, right? 35% of biodiversity loss attributed to animal farming. We have pollution of groundwater through nitrogen and fertilizers and all of that, which is related to this industry, right? So we're really looking at the industry with a massive impact when it comes to solving the climate crisis. It's quite obvious that a lot of that is related to the animals we're using in that system. The solution, of course, is, and many companies are working on this, is that we're moving away from animals for food production. Not entirely, because I think there's a couple of topographies, geographies where the production of food through animals obviously is useful and also is sustainable. But at the large masses that we do it today, it's not as sustainable. And so what we're looking at Formo, but also in other companies in this industry, is to use microorganisms instead of animals to actually produce food. And what we mean by that is, so instead of feeding nutrients to animals, cows for example, that convert it into something that we can use, meat, dairy, other things, we are domesticating microorganisms. And microorganism, fungi, yeast, bacteria. If you look into the numbers, and I'm going to use dairy because that's the focus of my company, Formo, roughly 96 to 90% or 90 to 96% of what we put into the organism cow in form of nutrients, we're losing in the system. So only 4 to 10% of what we put in, we can actually use as humans for food ourselves. Because you have a mammal that needs to sustain its own organism to grow and to sustain its life. Whereas with microorganisms, you have efficiency numbers of 60 to 80%. So we're only using 20 to 40%, which is 10 to 20x better than what you see with cows, for example, in dairy production. So we're putting microorganisms into fermentation tanks. We feed them with carbohydrates, with nitrogen. They grow, they produce proteins and other things that we can then use for food production, basically. When you look into the technology, we're not entirely where we can actually be. So the promises of that industry, and that is really important. We're talking about, what that production system, microorganisms, is able to do inherently, systemically, is amazing. So if you look into the numbers, using less land, less water, emitting less CO2, obviously no need for that much of antibiotics, etc. It actually shows that that system can be so much more efficient than what we have today with animals or with cows. And the funny thing here being is that when you look into the domestication of dairy cows, for example, that started 10,000 years ago. And so the system has become very, very efficient. So what we're competing with here from the microorganism side is something that we as human species have been, developing over millennia, right? If you look into the dairy yield cow per year, for example, over the past 100 years, it has quadrupled from roughly 2,000 liters a year to more than 8,000 liters a year. So we're competing with a system that we have made efficient over thousands of years. However, and that's the interesting thing, is that this technology is only a couple of decades old. But already now we see how it outcompetes the existing benchmark, many-fold. And so the promise obviously being that in the future we will see how we as a species move increasingly away from using mammals or macroorganisms, however you want to call it, and use microorganisms to produce the proteins, the fats, and the nutrients that we actually are going to consume as humans. Now, I said I'm going to talk a bit more broadly about that industry and why it's so interesting. And then maybe one thought I want to leave you with is that if you think about geopolitically interesting technologies right now and how countries are trying to become independent of other countries when it comes to the production of the most important societal needs, whether we talk about the future of semiconductors, antibiotics, energy, green hydrogen, and so forth. We see many countries and regions trying to basically become more self-sustaining. And right now we see that as Europe specifically, right? Everybody's talking about where are semiconductors produced, 90% of antibiotics being produced in China. If they basically stop importing that into Europe, we would have a big problem. Green energy and so forth. But the really interesting thing about food right now is that we're on the cusp of a big disruption that will have a huge impact on our society, which is that in the future, we will produce a lot of the food through biotech. And that means that a lot of the innovation that is happening right now is protected through intellectual property. And so it's really important to think about who is owning that technology and whether you as a country, for example, have access to this. So just spend another 2 weeks in the Middle East and seeing, for example, how much effort goes into become, self-sustaining when it comes to food production and boost food security and food safety. And these are the technologies that really will disrupt the current of producing food. And so it's not only interesting from a point of solving the climate crisis, but increasingly it will become a national interest to have access to these technologies. That being said, the whole revolution or disruption has to be led by products consumers love. And this is, I think, to leave you with, a selection of what we're doing at Formo is using that technology to produce products consumers already know, to basically lower the entry barriers for consumers to get into the technology, right? To not make technology for technology purpose, but to actually offer something that to consumers that they really love, because such a disruption cannot come just politically or driven by great tech innovation. It needs to come from the consumers as well, right? And biotech specifically has, against the narrative of big food been a scary topic specifically in Europe when it comes to, let's say, genetic engineering or the use of biotech in general, right? But what we want to show as a company is that that technology, the microorganisms that we're using to produce proteins and fats, can really do something that we've never seen before, which in this case, in the case of Formo, is produce cheese that is, molecularly identical to what we have from milk or from cows, but produced through microorganisms. So it's not a plant-based product that a lot of consumers would argue, yeah, I'm not going to buy it because it doesn't taste or feel or function the way that the products I know. But these products being produced so much more sustainably, but in a way that consumers don't have to sacrifice. And whether you like that or not, whether you believe in the fact that, as consumers, we should change the way that we think about consumption, it doesn't matter, right? Consumers will basically opt for something that is affordable, that tastes great, and then the technology will really become, mass market competitive, and then we will be able to scale that technology to compete with the system of the cows, basically, and that's the whole idea. So what is to come in biotech and food is really scaling the technology, building and using the infrastructure to make sure that we can compete in the mass market on price with a system that we've been scaling for millennia. And Formo and other companies right now are doing it. So we are the first company who have actually launched these products in Europe. A week ago, by the way, so you can now buy them in Berlin and Hamburg, but we will start to roll this out nationwide and then Europe-wide very soon. So biotech in food is here, it's the future. Thank you very much for your attention. It's an industry worthwhile looking into.